Hey, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Thriving Thoughts. I'm your host, Dr. Sherry. Hold on to your hats, your fantastic red hats, that is, like my guest today, LaGina, founder of the LaRae Infinity brand. You guys, I'm so excited to bring LaGina to you for several reasons, but this woman is unstoppable. One, I love her fierce, driven, purpose-driven heart to serve women, particularly her sisters, women of color. I love what she's doing, and I wanted to bring her on the show because even people like LaGina, who have an amazing podcast called LaRae Infinity, Let's Talk. She's an artist. She's a self-ascribed party girl with a purpose. I want you to hear from her because LaGina is out there doing her thing. She is developing her brand, her mission, and not just in this distant way. She's developing her passion, pursuing it to deliver it to a very specific audience. She's an encourager of women, and that's what we do here on this podcast. So it makes sense that we partner. So listen, viewers, listeners, I want you to support LaGina and her podcast. All the links will be in the show notes. I love her energy, and I love the fact that she gasses herself up and she gasses you up. Hey, full disclaimer, friends, in this episode, there is some profanity. I'm going to get out of the way and let LaGina share more with you about her motto, which is to tell your story, be your own brand, live your truth, and stand in your moment. Please enjoy my conversation with LaGina of LaRae Infinity.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited. We met serendipitously. So weird. But the couple times we talked, I'm like, oh, I like Dr. Sherry. This is good shit.
Yes. And I love listening to you on Instagram, and I've checked out your podcast. And so I'm just really excited to have you on the show today because originally, it's interesting, this podcast started out specifically for women. And really to share stuff that we don't really talk about. Sometimes we talk about with our closest friends, but sometimes we don't even talk about this stuff with our closest friends because we think there's something wrong with us, or there's something like, I'm not supposed to be thinking like that. Like, I can't let anybody know I'm thinking like that. And so originally this show started out for just women, and now I'm branching out to also host men. But you are such a powerful woman. I'm like, okay, I was going to switch back and forth and do man, woman this season. But I'm like, no. We're going to have LaGina on the show because I love your vibrancy. And that comes out not just in the quality of your message, in the power of your voice, but in the beauty of that hat, girl. That's boss right there. I like that.
Thank you. I love my hat too. I randomly got it during COVID season, shopping has been like a therapy always, but during COVID, it's just like, I'm like, oh my God. And, me and my sister were actually doing a girl kind of staycation, and there was an outdoor market, and the tents seemed far enough apart and the vendors had masks on. So we were like, should we go? And we went, and I was supporting another Black entrepreneur, and I bought this hat from her. So, and I've been rocking it out, especially in all my like virtual stuff.
Nice. I love it. Now see, I don't do hats. I do like, winter scullies because it's freezing outside, but I don't do like fancy hats. I don't know. You know what it is? It's not that people can't rock them. It's if you think you can't rock them, then you can't rock them. And I think I can't rock them. So I don't.
Exactly.
That's just how that goes down.
Exactly.
So thanks for being on this show, LaGina. This season, we're talking about a difficult topic that has become pretty popular right now simply because of the pandemic. Not even right now, over the last, 8 to 9 months, there's this hashtag of, alone together, which I think is garbage because I think there's a lot of people when they feel alone, they don't feel like they're together with anybody. That's the whole point of feeling alone, is you don't feel like anybody gets it. You don't feel like anybody has been where you've been. And the purpose of this season, I want to highlight stories of people who have not only been in those dark alone spaces, but people who have used them to truly grow, to thrive, to flourish. And I know you're one of those women. And I don't know all of your story because that's my commitment to the listeners and viewers and to you as the guest to keep this interview as authentic as possible. I don't like to know that much about you before we dive into a conversation on the show. So let me ask you this, LaGina. Is there a time in your life, and that time could be in the present, if you would
Mhm.
be, if it's there and if you'd be willing to share, but has there been a time in your life in which you have felt alone and you really didn't think anybody else understood where you are or could understand where you are?
Yeah. Um, when you're talking about being alone, it can come in several different levels.
That's
Um,
right.
I'm 35. I'm a middle child. I'm
Okay.
a hetero Black American.
Mhm.
So there's several different levels of being alone. As a middle child, I'm always like, nobody understands me. Is somebody that is an A-type personality and speaks out and um, can seemingly be thriving.
Mhm.
Those are sometimes times of being alone. You hear about the celebrities that commit suicide, like
Yeah.
Anthony Borden, like that one
Mhm.
fucked me, right?
Mm.
Because he killed himself, but like I'm watching him on TV and he's just
Right.
thriving.
Right.
And what is
Apparently. Yeah.
that? Right. So
Yeah.
what does that actually look like? And so
Mhm.
when you talk about, are there times that I feel like I've been alone? Of course, 2020, it's odd enough. I feel less alone
Mm.
than I have in a while, but I also think that that has to do with me putting a protective cocoon on myself when my dad died. And I used to call it Dark Gina, right? 2018.
Okay.
Dark Gina came around, and even coming out of that, people were like, oh, I didn't realize that you were going through something. And I
Mhm.
think it's, being a podcaster, moderating,
Mhm.
facilitating.
Mhm.
You sometimes hear people are like, check on the people that don't seem like they need to be checked on.
Yeah.
And I don't think I was ever in a place where like if somebody checked on me, it'd like save my life. But there those are the things that we're talking about. And so that's definitely what comes to mind is that, in 2020 with this alone together thing,
Mhm.
one thing I did think that came from it is that people were more willing to hop online and open up and have conversations.
Okay.
Um, and also, like you said, through your podcast.
Mhm.
When you told me about your podcast, our podcasts are very parallel
Yeah.
with what we're trying to do, what we are doing, what we're achieving.
Mhm.
And I recently opened up the conversation to men. So I'm excited that you've
Oh,
done that too.
nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I do feel alone. And
Yeah.
sometimes that is masked, I guess you could say, by the word thriving.
So, yeah, let's dig into that. I love this because it's legitimate, it's real, and it's something that there's two things in particular that I want to highlight that you just talked about. One, I feel like it's thriving alone in the limelight or thriving alone. And by limelight, I use that term loosely. I don't
Mhm.
mean, on the red carpet, Academy Award limelight. I mean,
I mean, one day.
limelight, right? You're leading, you have a following, people are watching you, they're listening to your message, right? You're a
Mhm.
messenger. And so you're leading in that way. And when you're in the limelight that way, and you're setting a stage like we are on this show, like you're doing on your show, you're setting a stage to talk about these things that people don't really talk about. People look to you as a person who's got it all together,
Mhm.
as the person who they couldn't possibly have these thoughts. And so I love that you bring that up because you are my person. You are my person to bring some truth to this
Mhm.
show and to the
Mhm.
people listening, because I know that a lot of the women and men now listening, they feel like that in their lives. I
Mhm.
know moms feel like that. I got to keep it all together. I've got to be the CEO of the household. I have to do this. I know business people feel that way. I know, specifically entrepreneurs feel that way. Like there is something wrong with you if you admit to any sort of frailty or doubt about yourself or this dark Gina, side that you talked about.
Mhm.
So let's dive into that a little bit because um, I think it's almost easier for people to talk about being in an alone space if they're physically alone outside of a relationship. But when you're surrounded by people like we are, I mean, I know that we're doing a lot of stuff remotely, but we're
Mhm.
surrounded by people. We're surrounded by personality. We're surrounded by relationship or opportunities, at least for relationship, right? So here we are in a different space. And you just touched on that, how maybe that's been a space that you felt alone in. So if we could focus on that a little bit,
Yeah.
specifically for the people listening and watching, I'd love that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that once you, whether you're accidentally put into quote unquote the limelight, because it looks
Mhm.
different for everybody. The
Yeah.
limelight could be 5 people that avidly follow you.
Yes.
Um, but in my
Beautiful
case,
point.
and in my walk, it's one of those things where, in my podcast, I say, women telling their unapologetic stories the way they
Mhm.
want to tell them in their own time and own
Mhm.
words.
Mhm.
And so being unapologetic and being very intentional and being very transparent, it's not always easy. Like when
Mhm.
I'm talking to my guests and when, even when I'm hosting or something and just being really authentic about who I am. And,
Yeah.
all these words are like charged right now, right? They're be authentic.
Authentic. Yeah. Right.
But really doing that, right?
Right. They do
Really,
have real meaning behind them. Yeah.
yeah, they do.
Yeah.
And people will be like, I'm being unapologetic, and then you turn around and you're like, I'm sorry. And it's like,
Right.
no. Um, and so I live in I live in my Cancer light. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I live in my Cancer light. I'm an introvert, extrovert. I say stuff sometimes and I'm like, oh, I said that, and everything else. So I'm just really trying to be transparent and
Yeah.
honest. Like
Yeah.
if I am having a problem versus acting like I'm not, and people are looking at me, I talk about it. I talk
Yeah.
about my dad passing.
Mhm.
When I'm having an interview with women, I'm not necessarily affirming them, but if something happened to me or I can relate to them,
Yeah.
or I can just sit back and listen and then be like, yo, that was fucked up, or oh, good job.
Yeah.
That's what I try to do because I'm
Mhm.
not perfect. I am I am fabulously flawed in so
Yes.
many ways
Yeah.
that I think that when we're going down that road, I just don't put on a persona. Like if
Yeah.
I trip right now and I fall out of my seat, I'm gonna be like, okay, I'm good. I'm good.
Right. It's so good. I think that I actually was talking with a friend of mine and I said, I bet people don't realize, and I'd be interested to know if this affects you as well. But some days I wake up as I call myself a messenger. I'm a speaker, a writer, a podcaster, a coach, but in all of those uh, venues, I share my message, right?
Mhm.
But there's some mornings when I wake up and I have significant doubt in my head, like, what do I have to share that's of value today? Who really needs to hear what this little teeny itsy bitsy thought is in my mind? And I remember I told her, I said, I bet you that people that follow me, you know, regardless if it's Dr. Sherry or just Sherry, people who follow me would never think that in a million years that
Yeah.
you have these doubts. And to me, that is an alone space, but it's not so alone anymore because I've used it to bring people like you on the show and shed light on it and talk about it. But yeah, I would say I'm a person who likes to bring the realness of my experience, the rawness of my experience and what I'm learning. Not just there's a difference, right? It's not just about sharing or lamenting or grieving something that you're going through. It's about sharing what you're doing with that.
Mhm.
That's the difference, I think, in being a leader with being in an alone space and sharing the dark spaces.
Mhm.
So how about you? You wake up in the morning, have doubts?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the more I know, the more that you put yourself out there, the scarier it is. Like you're getting
Mhm.
closer and closer and closer to the
Isn't
ledge.
that seems so counterintuitive that you would
Mm.
think the more you put yourself out there, the more accustomed you become to it.
No, I don't think you become accustomed to it until it becomes a practice. But as you're doing it, and as you do it the first time, and you're like, just like I said, I'm like, oh shit, I said that. But it's like, yes, I said that. And
Mhm.
sometimes I always tell my listeners, I'm like, give me feedback, talk to me,
Yeah.
because I don't know. I'm talking
Right.
into a mic, or I say things to people and they just have this blank stare, and I don't know if it's because they felt comfortable and they were like,
Right.
oh, like there's me, me as
Right.
well, or but even in this dating app episode, so I started Let's Talk on the Side, right? And that's just
Okay.
me and me talking. And I'm like,
Uh-huh.
I don't know if people want to hear that. And in the dating app episode, I'm talking about one of the apps, and I'm like, well, I wonder what it looks like. Because it's one of the apps where if you're the woman, you can swipe. And if he swipes, you have to do the first conversation.
Okay.
And I was like, that's heteronormatives. but I was like, I wonder what it looks like for like my gay people, my dudes.
Yeah.
And one of them, I didn't know he was gay, or maybe he's not. He didn't really say, I don't care. But
Right.
he was like, oh yeah, Gina. He goes, on ours, it's just whoever talks first. And I was like, oh, and I'm like, oh shit, people are listening. And it wasn't
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's great. You could, yeah, people are listening. And I have that same experience, I think, from time to time. It's not so much anymore, but I'm like, oh, I said that. Well, here's my belief about that. Like, I believe that everything that we speaks to somebody who's hearing it at the time that they need to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that. And so I don't believe there are mistakes. And if I say something that inadvertently hurts somebody, I know that I'm going to be confronted with that in myself to be able to say, hey, I've been thinking about that and I want to amend that, or I want to add to that. I think that's the other responsibility of just being humble. Like, feeling alone in the limelight requires me. That's one of the things I've learned about myself, is to be humble and to acknowledge that I don't know it all. And so in the vein of thriving, LaGina, we talk about thriving being learning about yourself. It's really a growth process. And so my question for you is, if you could share a little bit about maybe what are one or two things that you feel like you have learned about yourself as a person, how you have grown yourself as a person because of being this alone space in the limelight.
Yeah. The first thing I learned is that thoughts and opinions and emotions are not monolithic, right? Um, and we feel alone in them. Something happens to me. I think I'm the only one. I go into this dark spot. And then years later, when me as a person, I decide I'm comfortable with it and I say something to somebody, 10 people are, oh yeah, that happened to me. No big deal. Okay. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, oh, I wish I would have had this perspective 10 years ago, 5 years ago, a day ago, when I was like, oh my gosh, you know. And so even processing that, and then when I say things and the things that I think as I say them, I used to be worried and I'm like, oh my gosh, what happens in, a day or a month or a year when somebody listens to this podcast and then they listen to a more recent one, or when they hear me speak in person and my ideas and my thoughts have changed. And once again, one of those unapologetic moments, right?
Yeah.
Because in a moment, I'll use an extreme one that people have problems talking about, abortion.
Okay.
In a moment, let's say I thought one way about it and I thought it was horrible. And then I know a friend that gets sexually assaulted and gets pregnant and she wants an abortion. So do I know? So what I said before, is it still my opinion? And am I allowed to say something new? And I've learned through being on the mic and being at the forefront and all these things that I do where people are seeing and hearing and ingesting and digesting what I say, that I can develop opinions and thoughts and change them and
can grow on camera. I can grow on the mic. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's good stuff. I like that. So, but you said two things there. You said, in the alone space, my thoughts of feeling alone are not monolithic. And then you talked about being, sorry, I took some notes. You talked about being unapologetic as you grow on the mic. So can you break down the first one for us a little bit more?
Yeah. Like I was saying, so the whole reason I started the podcast is because people tell me things. I guess I'm somebody that people feel comfortable talking to. And I was raised to very much, if it's your thought, if it's your secret, it's not my job to tell those secrets.
That's right.
I'm a secret keeper and I have a horrible memory. So you could have probably told me something and I'm like, unless you mention it again and I go back into my go-go gadget brain, I'm you did? Oh, you did. Okay. Yeah.
LaGina's the best person ever to share a secret with. Okay. I'll remember that. That one's tucked away.
Yeah. I love having the secrets, but I don't feel a need to do things with them until the podcast. And I was just like, okay, women, we're going through these spaces. We're moving through them. The backslide's not happening as fast. Most of my friends are women of color. And I'm like, ooh, these things are happening. Like the birth stories and being in the hospital and doctors not listening to the pain threshold and all these things. And I'm like, hey, friends, sister, cousin, will you get on the mic and share this story with me that you told me in confidence? Because
Yeah.
I believe and I know that other women are going through it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started the podcast, I was humbled,
Yeah.
straight up humbled
Mm-hmm.
by all my friends and my family members just saying yes. And
Yeah.
so we get on there, we do that. And so that's what I talk about when it's not monolithic. Like
Yes.
we all go through some shit.
Yes.
And as women, we're very much like trained and conditioned, whether it's on purpose or an accident in society,
Yeah.
to make other people comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
and that's not right all the time.
no, it's not. And let me ask you this, because we have to talk to ourselves differently as we're learning, as we're growing. And if we really believe that truth that other people are going through or somebody else is going through, how do you, let me ask you that, how do
Mhm.
you in this space, when you're in those moments and you're having those thoughts and you're feeling like, even though you know logically other people are going through something similar, or you're not really truly alone, you feel alone. So what do you do mentally, logically, to get yourself out of that emotional space of untruth that says nobody could possibly know what I'm going through?
Yeah. Ooh. There's a lot of ways to go about it. So I definitely think that maybe not age. I always say that age and experience are not parallel. Some
No,
people
they say that. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Age and experience aren't parallel. There's people that go through things and shit in 1 year that some people don't experience in a lifetime. And I can use the example of myself. I didn't have daddy issues until I was 32 and my dad passed. And then I had daddy issues, right? And so dealing with that in my 30s is way different than dealing with that when I'm a teenager. I had my dad that said, I love you, baby girl, and you're beautiful and all this stuff. So I don't have those issues. And so as I realized, I look back at experiences and how bad I thought they were. And now I'm like, oh, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm like, they weren't that bad, or they were bad in the moment. And I respect that. So I respect where I am in the moment, but I also realize that where I'm going and how I'm going to get there needs the moment that I'm in. Mm-hmm. to either cause the experience to make you push harder, or just so that you don't do it the wrong way later on. So I just keep reminding myself, even right now, like when you ask that question about do you wake up in the morning and doubt yourself? Yeah, this morning and yesterday particularly, I was like, I looked at something. I'm working on opening a space here in Houston for women, and I see another space open up, right? And I'm like, oh, because that's the investors. I'm like, fuck, like the investors, like they keep asking that. But then I'm like, no, LaGina, you go back to your regular argument. Like there's 5,000 gyms.
Yeah.
And gyms get funded. And then I'm in the mirror putting on my little eye stuff for I'm not a good makeup person, whatever it's called. Whatever. And I'm in the mirror and I'm using an entrepreneur here in Houston. It's Lamink Beauty. Her name's Kim Roxy, and I'm using her makeup. And I'm like, you know what? There's a lot of makeup lines out there, and she's doing it. And she wasn't the first one to do it. Right. And I'm like, fuck this, LaGina, you got it. And I do my pose, and I'm like, you a bad bitch. Oh, you a bad bitch. And I just have to do that. And I know people do affirmations and yoga and stuff. And sometimes affirmations seem like cheesy, but I think just like with meditation, like you don't have to follow the plan or the subscribed way that people tell you to do it. I found that when I meditate, going into this state of writing helps me. And I find my power pose and my affirmation has a lot of cussing in it and a lot of gassing me up. And that's for me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. So perspective. I hear you talking about perspective, and I hear you talking about putting your emotions and your thoughts in their temporal place. So remembering that, okay, this is how I felt at one time, not judging that. And knowing that part of the growth is knowing that those thoughts change. That so I think that was a critical point of what you said, that whatever I'm feeling right now is legitimate and it's not eternal. So putting things in their temporal place, I think that is one of the biggest keys to getting through something in the moment.
Mhm.
Because in the moment, in those dark spaces of feeling alone, they can feel so overwhelming and so never ending that we convince ourselves, literally, we convince ourselves. I mean, look at Anthony Bourdain, look at Kate Spade, look at, I mean, Robin Williams, who all of these people, right? In that moment, they convinced themselves that this was it. This was
Mhm.
how it was always going to be. And that's intolerable. So I had to,
Mhm.
get out of that. And I am totally not, presuming what they thought. I'm just putting an umbrella understanding of what it's like when people come to the end and choose to end. It's because they're convinced at that point of something.
Yeah.
Whatever that finality is for them, I don't know, but they've become convinced of it. And so I think that is one of the beautiful tools that I've used is, yeah, I feel this way. This sucks and this isn't going to last.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. My brand motto is tell your story, be your own brand, live your truth, and stand in your moment. And literally, I was like laying on a couch one day and those like phrases kept going through my head. And I was like, I need to write this down. This might be a
I need
thing. Like, because it'll go in my head and slip out just in a quick moment. Like, if you heard the back end of my podcast, and I'll be in the middle of asking a question and it's like, nope, lost it. But, when I'm talking about telling, yes, all the time. When I'm talking about tell your story,
Yeah.
like speak it, don't hide it, tell it to remember it, tell it to celebrate it,
Yeah.
and then, be your own brand. That comes from the fact that, like, if you are your own brand, you are your biggest fan, you gas yourself up.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy. I'm not saying that, but like, I am my brand is me. Like, if I'm LaRae Infinity, but my name is LaGina. And so LaRae Infinity comes from my first and my middle name. And there's a story behind that. But I really think that, when you're thinking about business and who you are, you can be your own brand because that represents something. It's bigger than you. And then tell your story, live your truth. When you're when you're really, really living in your truth, it's not always pretty, but you don't shy away from it. And I mean, man, there's so many times my truth is not pretty and I'm still talking about that truth and still being okay with it and being able to forgive myself for some of it, and also celebrating the stuff that maybe I thought wasn't a big deal because I was going through it, but I did some cool stuff and I'm like, oh my gosh, I did that. Why didn't I celebrate it more? And then and then that ties into standing in your moment. Like, stop for a second where you are and stand in it, whether it's the shit that you're turning into fertilizer to make something grow, or standing in like your absolute excellence in what you're doing. Because if you keep comparing yourself to other people, you're never going to realize your greatness, because, this is a big deal being on somebody's podcast. Somebody took time to ask you to do something. And if you brush that over, you're missing standing in your moment and being like, I'm on her podcast. Dr. Sherry asked me to do this.
It reminds me of the movie Yes Man with Jim Carrey. Did you ever see that?
I don't know.
Basically, he goes to this motivational speaker, and the motivational speaker is like, the key to life is to say yes to everything, right? And so he goes through life, and somebody's like, hands him a flyer and is like, do you want to take guitar lessons? And he's like, yes, So anyway, he has all of these phenomenal experiences, some of which are ridiculous, but he has all of these phenomenal experiences that grow him as a person. And so when we pass up those opportunities, to me, that's because we're thinking so narrowly with, like, to use your word, thinking so narrowly with our brand.
Yeah. There's another movie with Eddie Murphy, and it's this wisdom tree or something. He gets cursed / blessed by like a Buddhist, somebody, a shaman, I don't know. And every time he says a word, a leaf falls. And by the end, he has to communicate and appreciate things in a different way because he can't speak. Because every time he speaks, the leaf falls. And the premise is, by the end, if all the leaves fall, his life is over.
Oh, okay.
And so he starts appreciating his family, and he starts seeing his kids different, and he starts seeing his job different. And he realizes that sometimes less words and more listening are better.
Mhm.
And so when you talk about Jim Carrey, it brought me to that movie with Eddie Murphy.
Yeah. No, that's good. See, all right. So now we're both going to have to go and watch both of those movies. But I love this, telling all of your motto. It ties into these. Basically, your motto is things that you learn in the alone spaces because you don't learn those things
Mhm.
in spaces of comfort.
Yeah.
You just don't. I mean, you don't grow, you don't stretch when things are going well. You don't need to.
Mm.
Right? We grow
Yeah.
and we learn through adversity, and that is through our adversity is our own story, whatever that adversity is to us. And so I think that's beautiful, beautiful wisdom. The other thing that I wanted to add to that is it's not just that you miss out on your greatness, so to speak, when you don't tell your story, when you don't what were your words? Be your own brand. When you don't live your truth, when you don't stand in your moment, but you miss out on your opportunity. You miss out on your people,
Yeah.
miss out on opportunities to serve people who need you. And that is my firm belief. Like, man, if we wake up and we have breath in our lungs and we have something to say, then there's somebody on this earth who needs to hear it.
Yeah.
So, my attitude is when I'm in the alone spaces of, for example, podcasting, and let's say I check out my stats or whatever, and I'm like, okay, they're looking good, but they could look better, right?
Yeah.
See, okay, yeah, right. Right. You look at your stats and you're like, okay, they're good. They could be better. This is nice. Oh, that's surprising. Have listeners in Russia now. That's weird, but okay, maybe.
You do too? Okay. Can we talk about that real quick?
Let's talk about it. Go.
Because yeah, let's talk because
What's happening?
I was on my analytics and it was probably November.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, I'm getting listeners all over the world. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're global. And then I'm like, Russia. And it's two listeners.
I have 6
Okay.
in Russia.
Okay. And then, places, South Africa, shout out to my South Africans,
Yeah.
Australia, big up to my Australians. I've interviewed 2 women from different places in India. So of course I have listeners
Sure.
in, every place around India that Indians live,
Yeah.
but Russia.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Well, so it's funny because I've had listeners on 6 continents, but it hasn't been until the last 2 months that I had Russia. I'm like, that's so weird.
Yeah, I get nervous. But if because
I get nervous.
I get nervous, but at the same time, I want the stories of women and the
Yes.
conversations of
Yes.
women and the fact that I want everything woman to be normalized.
Yeah.
If people are listening, especially of these stories of women of color in the United States and
Yeah.
the stuff that actually happens to us, and it's not a myth, it's not being gassed up, but it's actually being iced over a lot, like icing over a cake. And so if people can hear these stories, like you were saying about being in the box, like getting out of that box and understanding, I think it brings people to this equalizer and this commonality, because as we like grow as humans and you realize that the box that you're in, if you step out of it and you see other people, you can understand more of what's going on in the world. That includes not having the one Black friend, right? But having the diverse body of friends and the friendship and celebrating the color, because we are not colorblind.
That's
Why?
right.
Hell no.
That's right.
I see colors. I wish I was a little bit more chocolatey. The older I get, I fall into my Davison jeans and I get a little bit more yellow. I was chocolate cherry when I was younger, but like, I see color and people need to see color because of the danger. Yeah. And so when we're talking about Russia, that's the same thing. I'm like, oh my gosh. Okay. So cool. Like you're listening to this Black American girl tell the stories of a whole bunch of diverse groups of women. So I'm like, big up. What up, Russia?
and so that hits exactly on the point that I wanted to make, is that when you are doing all of those things, I love your motto. I think it's beautiful when you are doing that with the ultimate message of being you and celebrating you, not conforming you, not trying to mold you, but being you, defining you, celebrating you, going out and being you unapologetically, like you say. I think that's beautiful because we're going to reach the people that need to hear the message. Because if you are and I'm not going to say fake because that implies some sense of being malicious, and that's not what happens. I think people are misled into thinking they need to have something that's formulaic, something that the influencers are doing, and something that if other people are doing it this way, then I must be doing it that way too. And
Mhm.
so maybe this is just an opportunity for you. Let me ask you. I have my own thoughts, but this show is not about me. I have my own monologues on Fridays, but what are your thoughts? What do you tell that person who is struggling with that? Maybe they're an entrepreneur, maybe they're a woman, and they're looking at other people and they're comparing themselves and they're going, I know what my story is. I want to live in that. I want to celebrate my moments, but I'm really struggling when I look around and I see other people doing it and doing it successfully this way. What do you say to them?
I don't have an answer because I struggle with that, right?
Yeah.
I keep reminding myself that like I can I'm genuinely happy for people. So I celebrate the fact that I'm genuinely happy for people.
Mhm.
And I keep reminding myself that my time is coming. I'm a hard worker.
Mm,
I'm genuine. I care about
okay.
people. My brand is a social impact brand. So I do realize it may move a little bit slower.
Yeah.
And even in the alone times, I could have been off camera crying, which I wasn't today.
Yeah.
But, there are days that
Yeah.
I'll be crying and then I'm like, okay, LaGina, pop the eyes a little bit. And I'm like, okay, here we go. And I have to realize that I'm not being fake even in those moments.
That's right.
I'm just getting endorphins. And
Yes.
the
Yes.
more people like feed off of me, the happier I am. But
Yeah.
I have to be careful that my thriving isn't always when I'm in a low point, right?
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
because I notice that I'm really good at thriving or seeming like I'm thriving or seeming like I'm okay. And so even like through the podcast and over the last several years, it's me saying, no, I'm not okay.
Right.
How are you? Because when people, how are you doing? And everything, I'm very well. How are you? No, I'm
I
like,
don't
today's
Oh,
a
people
fucked up day.
regret.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
regret when they ask me that. Don't ask me how I'm doing unless you want a real answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause I'm going to give you a real answer. And
Yeah.
when I ask, you don't have to give me the real answer, but I'm asking
Yes.
genuinely and not in passing, cause that's something we do. So my answer to it is once again, like standing in it and just
Yeah.
realizing where you're at and being okay with it
Yeah.
and being willing to change it. And, word of 2020, pivot, pivot,
Okay.
pivot,
Yeah.
pivot, pivot,
Well,
pivot.
okay. So speaking of pivoting, let's pivot right now. Let's talk more about you and how you're thriving in your business. LaGina, tell us about LaRae Infinity, how it started, what the mission is, what you do, and how you can serve the people listening and watching.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. LaRae Infinity started is with my art, and my art brand was actually my eye artistry. I, and I think I may go back to that eventually. But as the my eye artistry grew, the
Wait,
year
my eye.
my eye,
Okay.
a play on words, like
Okay.
my eye artistry with
Yeah.
my eye. So
Got
my
it.
eye. And I may move back to that eventually. But in 2018, when my dad passed, this is this moment of thriving, right?
Mhm.
I did a full art show with a full art series, launched a brand, and turned into a sole proprietor that year. I
Wow.
and I had to do it just to stay sane. And everything.
Okay.
"Oh, you're doing so good." And the art show was a success. We raised like $1,400 in a night for Whole
Wow.
Planet Foundation. I had two artists in an artist loft with some of my old favorite paintings. One of my clients came, I guess, up from Laredo to pick up a piece that he purchased after I posted it on IG. I
Oh,
had, I had, Casita Boricua, a food truck there. I had Love Fats ice cream. I had Dolce Vita tequila. I had the Texas International Wine Competition
okay.
pouring wine. And I had this beautiful art series called Birthright. And it's my blood, my skin, my royalty. This is actually a piece from
Mm.
it.
Oh,
And
nice.
so my blood is red, my skin is seemingly black, and gold for my ancestors and my crown and my royalty.
Mhm.
Um, and so I was thriving, right? Like it was good.
Yeah.
But I was still dark Gina and
Yeah, yeah.
I was so sad. I felt empty. I really did. So sad. And so that's one of those moments, like a most recent personal moment where it seems that I'm good. It seems I'm okay. And I was good on the surface. And I think that's what really counted for me right then. It's like I just needed to keep going. So I didn't become ugly. So I acknowledged that I was like, I'm dark. And apparently my dark wasn't dark. People were like, but you were like, I'm still giggly, I'm still fine and everything, but
Right.
everything felt like, yeah, I'm doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting that done. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Wow. So how did you mentioned, so that is true thriving. That's using pain as your fuel to grow,
mm, yeah.
prosper. So tell us a little bit about when you and I chatted on the phone. You have a radio show, you have your podcast. So this is this is an umbrella. This is your brand. So
Yeah.
um, and tell us more about like where people can find your art, where people can find your podcast, what you talk
Yeah.
about. If you're looking for guests, this might be an opportunity to find somebody who fits with what you're looking for and the message that you want to share. And tell us about your radio show.
Yeah, absolutely. So my brand kept growing because I'm doing, all this philanthropic stuff. And then like I told you, then I'm like, oh, I need to do a podcast. I was geeked out on NPR. I
Okay.
love NPR. I still love NPR and MSNBC, but I'm listening and NPR does these great podcasts. So this format started coming into my head. And so I started doing the podcast. And since my brand is LaRae Infinity, I was like, let's do LaRae Infinity. Let's talk. And let's talk came because I'd be like, hey girl, let's talk. Like with my friends, I'd be like, bitch, what's up? Let's talk. So it just became natural. Lo and behold, it's probably the only thing in the podcast realm that I did not research. Okay, LaGina, everybody has Let's Talk. So if you're looking for my podcast, type in LaRae Infinity and you'll see LaRae Infinity Let's Talk. I have a fly-out logo, all that stuff.
Okay.
And so the art is under LaRae Infinity. The podcast is under LaRae Infinity.
Okay.
And being an entrepreneur now, I'm opening a co-working space, a workspace, Scratch Co-working, a space here in Women, a space for women here in Houston to collaborate, build community, co-work, and be creatives and their teams that they lead. And so all these culminate into me finding a problem, which is that, I'm an artist, I'm a podcaster, I do this, I do events, and I help through my philanthropic endeavors. I help nonprofits put on events. And I'm like, I'm always looking for space. I'm always looking for a place to be comfortable. I go into some spaces that are meant for working and it's like officey and super blue. Or I see a whole bunch of people that don't look like me and directly white males. And it's always cold in there and all these things. So I was like, that's the problem. And a lot of people that I know that need these spaces, women of color, don't know anything about them. So we're missing a huge target market, right? Because entrepreneurs are right now women of color, Black women winning. But the target market is slowly gearing toward them. And so I'm like, oh, there's other people too. And so the solution is the us space. And so I'm working on funding it and getting it open in the 3rd and or 5th ward of Houston, where, there's deserts, we commonly hear food deserts, but there's all kinds of deserts. Like the resources just skip there or they're put there through a grant and they get yanked out or they're half-assed done. So I'm just working on having a space. It doesn't mean people from other areas can't come, but there's a lot of people within neighborhoods that are looked over and communities that are looked over that need support. And so I'm starting with the us space for women and their teams, like I said, to collaborate, co-work, build community, and create.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Love that. Yeah. Thank you for what you're doing. And hey, is there anything that I have not asked you, LaGina, that you wanted to be sure to share with the people watching and listening now that you've got this captive audience, including those 6 people in Russia?
Yes, 6, 7. And we'll make it 8 because I'll make sure I share this on my platform. So you asked about the radio show. So, I just closed out season 2 of Let's Talk, where women are telling their unapologetic stories the way they want to tell them in their own time, in their own words.
Mhm.
I started the spinoff, Let's Talk on the Side. That's just a personal challenge. It's one of those things that I'm fabulously failing at. Like I'm learning quickly. I'm missing my targets. It's fine.
It is fine. Yes.
It's fine. So I need to build content in that. And then I also, like I told you, I brought men into the conversation. So we have Let's Talk on the Side, or Let's Talk to Men About It.
Okay.
And it's not a battle of the sexes. This is talking about women and talking about women's perspective, through the scope of me and maybe some girlfriends that I've talked to. And I've packaged it all up in a cute little bundle.
Okay.
And, I have a radio spot on All Real Radio.
Okay.
It's out of Houston, Texas, in the 3rd Ward. Denise is the co-founder and GM. And Drew's the GM, and Denise is the co-founder, and they really have this beautiful radio station going to build voices and amplify the community and the things going on. And the first thing I asked when I signed, I was like, okay, y'all, because I know y'all have heard me. I cuss just a little. Just put a warning on the front. That's what I researched and did. But so the first thing I asked when I joined the radio, when I was having my interview to be a part of this radio station, I was like, okay, because they go over everything, and they're like, do you have questions? I'm like, yes. My first question is censorship. How does that work for you? Because I always say it. I want my guests to feel free to go where they want to go, and they and they should and will. And I'll be there on the ride with them. I'm backing them up. I'm gassing the tank and everything. And so I really appreciate that All Real Radio is letting me like double my platform, because I'm packaging my podcast into a radio spot. And eventually, I have this beautiful radio voice. So I do want to, thank you. I do want to do live shows and everything. But right now, as I'm transitioning and learning, it's really cool to have my podcast in a radio spot for 2 whole hours. So
that's incredible. What a gift.
Thursday nights from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Central Time, the adult time, the appropriate time for my podcast.
Sure.
So that's me. We're just normalizing everything in the conversation about women through Let's Talk and the spinoffs.
Okay. Love it. Thank you. So you're going to get all those links to me so we can include those in the show notes so that everybody knows exactly how, when, and where to find you. And LaGina, the last question that I ask every guest, and you are no exception, is if you could leave the listeners and the viewers watching, listening with one truth that you don't want them to forget when the show ends, what would that be?
Okay. My one truth about thriving alone is that you're going to learn lessons. Lessons are something to be learned. I always roll my eyes, but it's so true. Like, stuff happens for a reason, but things really do happen for a reason. And sometimes you won't always understand the reason till a lot later. And sometimes you go through things to help other people understand themselves. And I talked about this with a woman of faith that I know. And I listened to her sermon because she did a sermon in another country, and it was like at 4 a.m. So I jumped on YouTube and I listened to her sermon, and she goes, hey, let me ask you what your takeaway was. And I said, I'm really starting to get comfortable with the fact that my path, I'm an off-roader. And when I go off my path, sometimes it's to bring people back to theirs. And so really, like, when you're thriving and when you're alone and when you're not thriving, acknowledging, accepting, understanding, trying to grow and understand who you are all the time is so important. In this road called life. And in your failures and in your successes, you learn. And sometimes it's easier not to say something, but you feel better when you do.
What an energizing, authentic, engaging conversation with my new friend, LaGina. Please do, friends, go and support her. You can go to LaRaeInfinity.com to learn about all that she does and to find out all of the different platforms and areas in which she serves her community of women to uplift them, strengthen them, and encourage them. I hope that you have found that to be true for yourself today as you've listened to LaGina's message of thriving alone, even in the limelight, even in the struggle of coming up and believing that it is going to be your time. Be sure to follow her on Instagram, Facebook. I think she's doing some stuff on Clubhouse now. And just another heartfelt thanks to LaGina for joining me on the show today. Friends, join me this Friday for a solo episode where we're going to be talking more about developing and using thriving thoughts in a way that sometimes you don't think is possible, in a way that sometimes you don't think you can stick with. And I would love to invite you to join my Thriving Thoughts texting community. All you need to do is text the word thrive, THRIVE, to 540-369-2139. Join us to engage with 3 thriving thoughts from me straight to your text messaging inbox per week. And you get to respond to me and we get to engage. I'm your personal Thriving Thoughts coach. Friends, do please share this episode with a friend. Not just this episode, but this podcast. Remember, this episode and this show and LaGina's show is being listened to all over the world. So we would love your shares to other points on the map, to other people that come to your mind right now that need to hear this message. I so value your support, and I look forward to seeing you right back here on Friday for another episode. Until then, friends, remember to speak truth over the lies, and you will thrive in any and every circumstance.